Good evening. Thank you very much for being part of this important meeting of the Higher Purpose Forum, co-hosted with HJ International Graduate School of Peace and Public Leadership. This is our fourth meeting on the topic of the unity of science, spirituality, and religion. It's an area that Higher Purpose Forum is becoming very committed to. And our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Wilson. Dr. Andrew Wilson, and we really appreciate his involvement in Higher Purpose Forum. This is the second time he's been a part of a conversation on this particular topic. I'm the director of Higher Purpose Forum. My name's Jim Edgerly, and we founded Higher Purpose Forum in September of 2019. We're so honored that for the last half a year or so, our programs have been co-sponsored by HJI International Graduate School. And I'd also like for you to hear a welcome from the representative of HJI, Dean Stephen Boyd.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and thank you to everyone who's joining our program. We have a very interesting and I think great topic tonight. We're so grateful to be able to co-sponsor this event with Higher Purpose Forum. I'm the Dean of Enrollment Management and Student Life here at HJ International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership. That's our new name. Everybody's still getting used to our long name. So we're really pleased to be here tonight, and we hope that something that you hear tonight can really stimulate a further interest in the programs of study and the courses that our institution offers. So to that end, at some point in the program, I'll be putting my name and contact information in the chat box, along with some key links about programs of study. And even if you'd like to apply, I'll share with you the link for the online application. So thank you all for coming. Look forward to a great program tonight. And thank you again. I'll hand it back to Jim.
Thank you, Dean Boyd. You have been so patient in all the uncertainties dealing with me and setting up these programs. I really appreciate how you've been willing to work with me. It's been a pleasure for me. I'd like to now share my screen and get this underway. Our topic today is evolutionary creationism, a new perspective on purpose and human origins. It's a talk that will be given by Dr. Andrew Wilson. He's a professor of scriptural studies at HJI International Graduate School. He's been actually on the faculty there, I think, since 1985, formerly UTS. And our respondent, we're really happy to have for the first time participating in a program of Higher Purpose Forum, Alison Wakelin, whose reputation precedes her. And she's an assistant teaching professor in physics and astronomy at Widener University. That's in Delaware. After we finish with the speaker and the respondent, we'll have about 30 minutes of moderated discussion in which we hope very much that you will be a participant. I'd just like to very quickly go over the areas of content development for a Higher Purpose Forum. The basic area we've been developing since 2019 is the topic of race and providence in America. And we are now giving public presentations on this important topic. It's sort of a presentation of a worldview. And then we have three areas where we're developing what we call a counter-proposal, new ideas that express the vision of unificationism. The first of those is building a racially integrated culture. The second is the area of justice and economic democracy. And the third area is the area of tonight's meeting, the unity of science, spirituality, and religion. I'd like to just say that our upcoming meetings feature meetings in these areas. On May 7th is our second topic, a presentation by Dr. Wilson in this series. And his talk will be titled Reverend Moon's Early Writing on Science. And specifically, he'll be referring to the text of the first book, maybe it's actually the second book that Reverend Moon wrote on the topic of the divine principle, and it has considerable content referring to his understanding of science. So Dr. Wilson actually has been working on translating that book for the last 10 years, and he's going to share that with us. And then on May 21st, Alison Wakelin, who's our respondent today, is going to give a talk on the unity of science, spirituality, and religion. On June 6th, we'll have our next installment on justice and economic democracy. We'll have a talk on the Catholic view of social justice by Michael Greeny from CESJ, who's sort of our partner organization in this topic of economic democracy. And our respondent will be Dr. Walsh, the president of HJ International Graduate School. And then we'll have another installment on the issue of racial integration. The title is God's Dream of Building a Racially Integrated Society. That'll be presented by Christine Edwards and Jeff Kingsley. So today's meeting, as in all of our meetings, our participants represent a range of faiths and perspectives. So we want to make sure that in the language we use and the approach we take, everyone feels included and welcome in this forum. During our discussion period, which had started around 7:05, it is a very important part of our program, and we encourage your participation. And what we'd like to ask you to do is, if you'd like to make a comment or raise a question, to use the raise hand function in Zoom so the moderator can call on you. And then once you are called on, then you put your hand down. If you don't want to speak, you could simply place your comment or question in the chat box, where it will be handled by our chat moderator. This meeting will be recorded, and it'll eventually be posted initially on the HJI website. And we intend this meeting to end no later than 8:30. So I'm just going to briefly introduce our two speakers today. Dr. Andrew Wilson. Dr. Wilson's scholarly books and papers cover diverse topics ranging from religion and peace to character education to the theory of the spiritual world. His efforts on behalf of interreligious harmony led him to write World Scripture, a contemporary anthology of sacred text, which has become a standard work of interfaith scholarship and a resource for interfaith worship. He also wrote the second volume of World Scripture that includes a broad selection of Reverend Sun Myung Moon's words, which has been adopted as one of the 8 official textbooks of unificationism. Dr. Wilson joined the faculty of HJI in 1985. He is the professor of scriptural studies and the director of scriptural research. He earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard University, majoring in biochemistry, a master's degree in theology from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD degree from Harvard University. So this guy is Harvard through and through. We are very appreciative of Dr. Wilson's involvement with the Higher Purpose Forum. As I mentioned earlier, this is the 3rd meeting in which he's been a speaker. And then our respondent today is Alison Wakelin. Ms. Wakelin is on the teaching faculty of Widener University in Delaware, specializing in physics and astronomy. Her areas of interest is her area of research interest is the formation of structure in the early universe. Wow. She studied applied mathematics at Cambridge University, earned a master's degree in astronomy in astrophysics at Princeton University, and a master's of religious education at the Unification Theological Seminary. Well, Dr. Wilson, it's time for me to turn over the program to you. We're, again, appreciative for you to bring up this important topic as our next installment on the topic of unification, the unity of science, spirituality, and religion.
Thank you. It's good to be back on the Higher Purpose Forum. This is an absolutely wonderful forum for all kinds of a great discussion and thought about the direction and future of this world, and including the future of ideas around the topic of science. And earlier in this forum, there was a presentation on evolution and religion. And so I was motivated to speak up and say, okay, I'm going to give a little talk about this kind of topic too. And so let me share my screen and begin basically a 2-part presentation. I'll call this topic Evolutionary Creationism. And I think try to explain what I mean by evolutionary creationism and why it's different from theistic evolutionism. which was another way that people who believe in God talk about evolution. But the starting point for this topic of theistic evolutionism or evolutionary creationism, to me, creation has priority because, at least in unificationism, the principle that we teach gives priority to mind over matter. And therefore, the cause of the material universe is mental, spiritual, and ultimately the creator, God, is the cause, and material creation is the result. So God is the ground of science, whereas a lot of times with theistic evolutionists, they simply accept evolution that science is proposing as a fact, and say that, well, this is the method that God chose to develop nature. The problem with that view is that evolution itself, as Darwin defined it, makes matter the ground and leaves God at the periphery. So you have a hard time figuring out just how God can be involved. And Darwin himself said, we don't really need God to explain evolution. Whereas my position, evolutionary creationism, starts with God and shows that God's principle demonstrates the phenomena of nature that scientists call evolution. So the principle of creation in unification teachings is the philosophical ground for connecting science, religion, and science. And there are a few points in the principle of creation that are basic. First, God's form is duality in relationship. God is a being of duality, of masculinity, of femininity, and these are in constant harmony in relation with each other. And God created everything in the universe to make object-partner relationships in the form of God's self. So just as God is a being whose parts are relating to each other, the universe is composed of pairs of male and female creatures, of even in the world of astronomy, things are in relationship. Planets are in relationship with their central stars and so on. And all of those object-partner relationships are manifesting at some level the form of God's own self. Male and female join and take God's form in conjugal union and then co-create offspring as their second self. Unificationists call this origin, division, union. And so God's purpose for creating the universe is to have an object-partner relationship with it, to have a relationship with a universe that God can relate with personally and intimately. And God can do that through human beings who stand at the crown of creation. Furthermore, human beings are the mediators who can comprehend the universe, the physical world, through science, and connect it with God through their spirituality. So human beings are like the linchpin of God's creation that makes creation meaningful to God, the creator who created the universe. So the principle of creation says that everything grows, everything develops, nothing is created fully formed. Adam and Eve weren't created fully formed as an adult man and woman. They were created to grow through stages of growth, like everything. Beings grow through 3 stages: formation, growth, and completion, to reach perfection and fulfill the principle. So God created the universe and had it develop with stages, and this correlates somehow with the Bible's depiction of creation in 6 days. The point about growth through stages is that there's purpose at the end of that growth. It's not just evolution by chance and accident, drifting along so that something can emerge. There is already a purpose and a goal behind growth. So stars, planets, living beings, everything emerged for a purpose. We might say that from the time of the Big Bang, which correlates with Scripture, God said, let there be light, there has been the development of, through millions of years, of various forms of atoms, molecules, proteins, and finally creatures who can even contemplate the universe that they were created in. That's what we have today in human beings who can study the universe and understand it. So modern cosmology could be consistent with creation. The universe beginning from one point, like the Bible says, God created by saying, let there be light. And that pure energy, the light at the moment of creation, was in fact a superhot plasma that cooled to form atoms, stars, and planets. And the outcome of all of that creative work is intelligent beings who can comprehend the whole. And how could that be? It seems like a lot. So we have this issue, which in cosmology called the anthropic principle. And behind the anthropic principle is the idea that the universe was finely tuned so that the outcome would be intelligent life, and specifically human beings. I take this as evidence of creation. So, in other words, that the universe is fine-tuned so that life could emerge. And therefore, human beings did not arise by chance. It was in the design of creation itself, through the laws and mathematics and physical constants, that entities in the universe would form in stable arrays that could develop into stars and planets that could go around stars, that could have stable atmospheres and temperatures such that life could emerge in them. And it's finely tuned because even a small change in the physical constants that govern the development of the universe would make it unfit for life. The universe would either expand and contract and blow up, or it would expand so rapidly that it would that nothing would congeal into stars. But in fact, the universe is fine-tuned so that everything works out such that there can be the planet Earth where human beings can live and develop science in which they could contemplate the universe. And there are many, many pieces of evidence that indicate this fine-tuning. And I'm not even going to go into it because it's all very technical. Peculiar properties of water, that when water freezes, it floats instead of sinks. The gravitational constant, which is if it were too weak, the planets and stars would not form. If it was too strong, the stars and stars would burn up too quickly. The strong nuclear force, if it were only 2% weaker, no helium or heavy atoms would be formed from hydrogen. It had to be the right amount. The cosmological constant, which is the balance of gravity's attractive force with the repulsive force of quantum energy of a vacuum, it had to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 110 to the 120th power. The ratio of the electromagnetic force to the gravitational force between a pair of protons. If it were too small, the universe would be very short-lived because the protons would all collapse on each other due to gravity. And if it was too big, you would never generate larger atoms like iron and such. The ratio of the mass of the proton to the electron, the Hoyle resonance, which has to do with the formation of carbon and oxygen out of hydrogen and helium. All of these are fine-tuned, evidence of fine-tuning. So the anthropic principle states is an attempt by scientists to explain these observations of fine-tuning. And there are basically two different anthropic principles: the strong anthropic principle and the weak anthropic principle. The strong anthropic principle says that the universe is unique, and it must have these values of because its purpose is the emergence of intelligent life. In other words, there's an intelligent purpose behind the formation of the universe. This is the position of people who talk about intelligent design. That there's an intelligence, which we call God, but science, you could say intelligent design, that the universe would have the purpose to support the emergence of life, and the fact that it's fine-tuned is evidence for that. Or there's some kind of a life principle underlying existence that constrains the universe to evolve towards life and mind. So there are various ways of explaining the strong anthropic principle, but it has to involve some kind of intelligence or life inherent from the very beginning. Well, that is very distasteful to most scientists who are materialistic, so they prefer the weak anthropic principle. And the weak anthropic principle basically says that the fine-tuning that we see in our universe is the result of selection bias. Because of all the possible universes that could exist, only a handful have the properties suitable for sentient beings such as ourselves. We are sentient beings. Hence, the universe we see has all the right parameters for our existence. But there are an infinite number of other possible universes, and maybe those other universes exist, actually, and we just don't see them. And then you get the idea of the multiverse, that there are countless universes of which our universe is only one, and because it's the one that we live in, and because everything works for us to exist, we think of it as somehow designed, but it's not designed at all. It's rather that it's automatically selected from all the countless universes that ours would be the one that we live in. Okay, that's the weak anthropic principle. But there's no experimental evidence that other universes exist besides our universe. And positing multiple universes is quite cumbersome. How many multiple universes would there have to be? So we can use what's called Occam's razor, which is a principle in philosophy that the simplest solution is the best. The hypothesis of a single universe is simple and more parsimonious than positing multiple universes. Yet the reason most scientists prefer the weak anthropic principle, which requires multiple universes, is because they are materialists, and they are allergic to the concept of God or a designer having designed the universe. If it is a single universe, however, then its fine-tuning is evidence for the intelligent design of the universe by a purposeful creator, which would then contradict materialism. So that is the first part of my lecture. It's about astrophysics. The second part of my lecture is about evolution and biology. So that's where I'm going next. So if you have some questions or issues about the anthropic principle, please write them down in the chat, and we'll get back to it later.
Well, Dr.
For now, yes.
Dr. Perhaps I could just interrupt you before you go on to part two and just ask you, is there much of a following among scientists for the weak anthropic principle? Is it something that scientists take seriously even though there's no evidence for it?
I think in general, scientists are, most that I know, I don't know the field well enough, Jim, to really answer that question, but I would say it is a fallback position that is philosophically more comfortable for materialists to take.
As sort of a default explanation for the finely tuned universe.
Yeah.
I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but can you suggest a book that explains the strong anthropic principle and develops?
No, I'm not really in a position to do that.
Okay.
Sorry, Jim.
All right. Well, if maybe I'll ask you about that later on, and we'll send that out to our
All right, that's a good idea.
Very good. Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's move on to evolution. Evolution is a feature of creation. Okay, so that means evolution was guided by the principle. We can see evidence of the principle of growth through three stages in the fact that there are basically three eras in the evolution of life: the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic era. And so we can see the principal pattern of formation growth, and completion. In other words, evolution that we see of life is but a manifestation of principle. It is the purposeful development of life forms over billions of years to arrive at the goal of God's creative work, which is human beings who could know God and with whom God can have an object-partner relationship with. So just seeing the number 3 here, in terms of the geologic eras, it's indicative of the fact that there could be a principle of growth at work in evolution. So Darwin taught that evolution was purposeless, that it developed the way it did basically by chance, and natural selection would select out the most fit creatures to survive. But evolutionary creationism says that life unfolds to realize a predetermined purpose, namely God's purpose of creation. And if it is growth through stages, it implies that there must be an end point to evolution, which would be completion of the original design that God intended when God began creating. And that original design that existed before life began is something that would not be in the vocabulary of an evolutionist who follows Darwin or the neo-Darwinian synthesis that reigns in biology today. But for the evolutionary creationist, the basic theme of life unfolding to realize predetermined purpose means that survival of the fittest that Darwin saw is but a means to that end, an external cause of change, but internal cause is the unfolding of God's purpose. So let's look at this a little bit more. Stages of growth. Darwin looked at everything as species. Every species was an individual species, and just looked at his book is entitled The Origin of the Species. But if you look at the kind of a 35,000-foot view, we can see that we can see species as stages, as in stages. So extinct species are from earlier stages in the lineage of the modern creatures that exist today. And a very good example is birds. That we can see that dinosaurs were the growth stage of modern birds. That in the dinosaur era, feathers developed. And then another stage of development in the Mesozoic era of dinosaurs was the evolution of flight. And it was out of those stages, formation and growth, that we get to the completion stage, which would be birds today. And birds, of course, realize the final purpose to relate with human beings, who then, by our appreciating and enjoying birds and eating the products of birds, namely eggs and chicken, we can connect them with God. Another aspect of the principle that we see in evolution is giving and receiving. So, as I said, Darwin looked from the perspective of individual species and saw evolution as survival of the fittest. But if we look at the whole ecosystem, species exist in harmony with one another, where predators and prey are in balance. And these species, whether they're predator species or prey species, evolve together. So if we only look at this individual level, we see survival of the fittest. But if we look at the whole of life, we see ecosystems in which predators and prey are evolving in some kind of balance. So there's giving and receiving going on. For example, we can talk about symbiosis, where lichens is the example, classic textbook example is symbiosis of fungi and algae. So there's a fungus, and the algae is living inside the fungus. The fungus provides protection to the algae. The algae provides the energy for the fungus through photosynthesis. There's giving and receiving, and both benefit. Well, this is how life evolved, actually. For example, insects and flowering plants. They developed in a symbiotic relationship where the insects consume pollen and nectar from the plants spread their seed, and the plants developed flowers with colors and scent to attract insects. The insects spread their seed, and the plants develop flowers with colors and scent to attract the insects, and the insects in turn evolve mouth parts and digestive systems to be able to feed on flowers. So every type of flower is connected to a different type of insect, whether a fly, a beetle, a rodent, a moth, or a bee. And this development occurred simultaneously within a larger symbiotic relationship. Or going back even further, the development of all life began from prokaryotes, that is, cells without nuclei like bacteria. And these bacteria then join together to form eukaryotic cells, which are cells that have a nucleus, mitochondria, and if they are plant cells, they have chloroplasts for photosynthesis. And this was a symbiotic process. You had aerobic bacteria, which means bacteria that can breathe oxygen, and they entered and developed a symbiotic relationship with cells which had a more primitive metabolism that was anaerobic. Okay, well, I'm using big words here. What's an anaerobic metabolism? Is like when you generate energy by burning sugar and developing lactose and other kind of products in the blood, and you get tired. But then when you breathe a lot of oxygen, that can convert those sugars into carbon dioxide, then you get energy, much more energy when you have the ability to burn oxygen. So the primitive chemical reactions of the anaerobic cells that did not use oxygen and were very inefficient in terms of producing energy were very much benefited by joining with the aerobic bacteria, the prokaryotes, and together they formed mitochondria, which then grew to become an organelle within the cell. The cell is now protecting and enriching the existence of that formerly independent prokaryote. And the same with chloroplasts. So there were cyanobacteria that could metabolize carbon dioxide and light, and these entered primitive plant cells and became chloroplasts for photosynthesis. So both the host cell and the primitive bacteria benefited from this arrangement, and this was fundamental to establishing higher life forms. Happened by give and receive action, by symbiosis. Even this evolution of the brain, symbiosis is involved. So we have these retroviruses in the environment, which join into our DNA and become fixated in the DNA and are passed down through the generation. And it turns out that a lot of human cells have retrovirus DNA in them. And some of the retrovirus DNA in nerve cells were essential for the production of myelin, which is like an insulating material in nerves. And this is all very new. This was a neuroscience article from February 2024, which said that ancient viruses played a pivotal role in the development of myelin, which is crucial for complex vertebrate brains. The discovery of retromyelin, a retrovirus-derived element in the DNA, essential for myelin production across mammals, amphibians, and fish, underscore the impact of viral genes on vertebrate evolution. So we even should be grateful to viruses, because we would not exist if it wasn't for some primitive creature, primitive fish or something that ingested these retroviruses that produce myelin that help to develop the structures of the modern vertebrate brain and spinal cord and nerves and so on that allow these life forms to take the shape that they have. Symbiosis, give and receive action. Another form of give and receive action is sex. Sex is very inefficient. When creatures engage in sex, they become vulnerable to being eaten by predators, and they have to spend a lot of time, energy to attract mates. Why not just divide like yeast and not even worry about sex? But from the point of view of the principle, it's to manifest God's form of duality of giving and receiving, and thereby they share the best genes. So in science, we talk about sex as a way of selecting the best genes. Males, like a male peacock here, display fitness by having a glorious display to attract the best females. Females value the males with the greatest fitness. They invest in caring for his valuable progeny. And thus we have the evolution of beauty in the animal world as a result of giving and receiving, manifesting God's form. So all giving and receiving by the principle drives evolution. That's my conclusion. Giving and receiving by the principle is the primary driver of evolution, far more important than survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is just for cleanup. And evolution, because it is giving and receiving by the principle, manifests the principle's 3 stages of growth. Let's look at one more aspect of this, and that is epigenetics. This is also brand new stuff. It's only been coming out in the past few years. We are not only the product of our genes. Genes have to be turned on and off. And there are proteins called histones that turn the genes on and off. So our organism is not only defined by our genes, but just as important are the mechanisms that control when the genes are turned on and off. And all of our DNA exists in a matrix of these proteins. So these proteins can either open the DNA for activity, or they can block the DNA from acting. And all of this protein activity can happen through environmental changes. So genetic change through the environment, which, takes us back to Lamarck, actually, who said, giraffes grew long necks because they could reach higher in the food, higher in the trees for food. There's something of that going on, because scientists are noting that if people have certain bad health habits, for instance, like smoking cigarettes or alcoholism, it goes through the generations, 2 or 3 generations. Why does it go through the generations? Because epigenetic changes take place because of that behavior, which lead to health problems in the succeeding generations. Or on the contrary, good health habits introduce healthy epigenetic changes in the gene expression that go to the next generation and therefore have lasting impact in a good way. And people are studying epigenetics as a way of explaining the transmission of heritable traits in terms of disease and fitness. So what this means is that both genetics and the environment determine who we are. we are not just determined by our genes, we are also determined by the environment in which our parents grew up. And that environment that our parents grew up introduced epigenetic modifications that changed the way the genes express themselves, and thus we, the phenotype, that's us in the center, the phenomena type, arise both from the genotype, that is the genes, and from the epigenetics environment. If you want to figure out a theological explanation for original sin and the inheritance of fallen lineage, you can go to epigenetics to begin to understand how that could happen. Epigenetics modifications provide a mechanism for spiritual factors to influence evolution. This, to me, is the missing link that allows us to tie the material world to higher causes when it comes to evolution. And thus, Darwinism is out of date. We are at the beginning of developing a new holistic framework, conceptual framework for how evolution would take place. Darwinism and its modern synthesis, neo-Darwinism, only looked at the DNA and only looked at the genes and saw gene mutation and inheritance through Mendelian genetics as the only driver of inheritance. And thus, if changes were to happen, they would have to come by survival of the fittest. But in the larger integrated synthesis, we also have epigenetic inheritance. That means that the expression of genes is plastic and can accommodate different environments, and that the genome can evolve through environmental causes. And this creates a more holistic understanding of a human being and its ability to develop and evolve, and I think is going to be very powerful in terms of explaining a lot of phenomena in medicine and health. So there we have it. The conclusion, getting back to my main theme, evolutionary creationism. The universe was designed for a purpose. Evolution is a phenomenon of creation. The growth through 3 stages to realize God's purpose appears to be evolution, but it is actually growth through stages to realize God's purpose. The main driver of evolution is give and receive action, sex, sexual selection, symbiosis, and interactions with the environment through epigenetics. And survival of the fittest plays only a supporting role. And the modern plants and animals that exist and human beings that exist today are the result of stage-wise creation to form an environment for human beings, the crown of creation, and even our development as human beings can be explained in this way. And I want to thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope we can have a good discussion about it afterwards.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wilson. That was evocative. I think you're claiming here that give and receive action is the correct way, as a correction of survival of the fittest, that adaptation takes place through a process that isn't based upon selective adaptation. It's based upon give and receive action. Is that a kind of one of your basic points here?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Give and receive action is more causal. And the only way you can see it is if you look holistically and don't just look at as individual species, but look at the species in interaction with its environment and so on.
So, and you're saying that survival of the fittest is a kind of a cleanup phenomenon, because that's the way that species or variations within species that don't make progress come to a conclusion. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Let's see. So, Dr. Wilson, you're saying that God used an evolutionary process that took creation through several stages over, I think the diagram that you showed us had, I think it was 5 billion years. Did God do that? Did God choose evolution? Was it a learning curve, or is this just the way that God creates?
I think this is God creates through the principle. It's called the principle of creation because it's the way that God creates. We use this term principle of creation rather loosely in the unification lingo to simply mean the principle by which creation works. But also it is the principle by which creation happens. It's the principle by which we have children, male and female coming together and having sex and producing babies. So, and it is rooted in the very nature of God's own self, who is a being of dual characteristics.
That have give and take.
That have continual give and receive action. And in my next lecture, which I'm going to give in a few weeks, I'm going to talk about the Reverend Moon's background in electrical engineering, in which he talks about electromagnetic induction, like the fact that if you have a radio antenna and the electrons are moving in the radio antenna, it produces an effect of equal signal in the surrounding air or the surrounding space. And that can be likened as a metaphor to the way God creates.
So God creates in a pattern that resembles the pattern that exists within himself.
Yes.
And that's the pattern of of this reciprocal give and take relationship that evolves through synergy and sex and those kind of processes. That's the way progress takes place.
Yes.
Yeah. That's the progress that comes from the way that God's own nature, I see.
Yeah. And this is really important for society. I mean, I know the Higher Purpose Forum is interested not just in theory, but interested in social problems. So when you look, I mean, Marx was a great fan of Darwin. He wrote letters to Darwin. He thought Darwin was great because he really liked survival of the fittest. And if you believe that progress takes place through survival of the fittest, you can then simply extrapolate that in society to, social revolutions that kill off the undesirable races, as Hitler did. It's a very bad foundation for understanding social reality too. But if we understand that progress takes place through giving and receiving, we should have much more respect for one another. Even prey and predator relationships are giving and receiving. It's not that one is more valuable than the other. So there's a very different view of the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That was so interesting as a basis for our continuing conversation on this very important topic, which has so many important implications. And now
You're very welcome.
Yes, thank you. Let's turn to Alison Wakelin, our respondent. We're so happy to be able to have a chance to listen to her.
Thanks, Jim. Well, thank you, Andrew. Especially, I'd like to thank you for all your research on fine-tuning, because I'm teaching that in my class tomorrow. So I will use your research. And I'd just like to mention, you recommend we use the most parsimonious hypothesis. But remember, we're talking about a God who made 200 billion suns in the galaxy just to have one little planet for people to emerge on. Not to mention like hundreds of billions of galaxies. So maybe God is not so parsimonious. So in terms of your presentation, I have I mostly want to extend it more than anything else. I feel there was a few things that a few points which I will try to explain a little better, such as I feel it's a little top down. You put in some good, bottom up things such as symbiosis, horizontal gene transfer, epigenetics, and so on. But I think we have to go further than that. It's also, I think, a little masculine. Top down usually means masculine. So I'll explain that too. And then also, I think even physics today is actually looking beyond predetermined laws. There's quite a lot of people are suggesting that maybe the laws have varied throughout history, and there are other things also I'll talk about. Then the biggest problem I have, I think, is that the human is seen as the sole individual truth body with creativity and choice. Whereas I would say that every individual truth body in the creation has some measure of creativity and choice throughout all of evolution. And I think that's something that we can look at. I'm going to suggest we use process theory as a way to approach it. And then I think for the same reason, it doesn't really address process and change and how evolution affects God, and how you talk mostly about how God affects evolution, but evolution also affects God. So I think we need to look at that too. And then we haven't really looked in our understanding of evolution at a universe that came into being within consciousness. But that is a fairly major approach of many people today, to look at how everything, even an elementary particle, is conscious. And actually, the principle is one of the few places that actually suggests that even the particle has inherent directed nature. I think that's what we call it. So let me just expand on just one or two of those just a little bit. So in terms of the physics, so I don't think that physics and biology should remain separate when it comes to evolution. Biology refers to living organisms, yes, but according to the principle, again, even the particle has some element of consciousness. So I think we have to look for an evolutionary theory that includes physics. And since we had quantum physics, then basically most people accept that there has to be consciousness is somehow involved. And then also, I mean, physicists have tried to look for the laws that describe all of science and all behavior and so on. But Kurt Gödel back in the 1930s proved actually that the laws cannot be totally complete. He said that in any reasonable mathematical system, there will always be true statements that can't be proved. So at the time, physicists basically just ignored that because they didn't understand it. But now, I think for the last like 30 years or so, it's become a real part of physics, because it says that just looking for the laws is not enough, that we have to have something else. So several of the top physicists, again, have said, okay, we have to bring consciousness into this. And the same thing with actually quantum physics. Most physicists sort of we weren't able to understand the implications of it. But again, maybe in the last 30 years, we've really started to look at the implications. So there is even something called causal set theory today, where people are just looking at space and time as sets of discrete points to see if you can actually create the laws of physics from simply that. So that's a little bit speculative right now, but it means that we have a different understanding of the laws. So I think we have to look at that and how does that affect the idea that God is guiding evolution through the laws. Okay, so basically, I think that the presentation essentially assumes that there's something ontologically very different between the human and the rest of creation. And of course, that's true. I mean, we are the sentient beings. By the way, not every astronomer would agree that humans are the last word. Quite astronomers these days mostly believe that there are alien civilizations, and I'm not going to get into that. At this point, I don't have an opinion. And if I do have an opinion, I suspect that humans are still the pinnacle of creation at this point. But I think it's a very interesting question. So I think that we should consider looking at process theory, the theory of Alfred North Whitehead. My understanding is that at the beginning of the 20th century, this was a time when both the masculine and the feminine perspectives should have emerged into the world, like the truth, so to speak. And our theology suggests that the feminine did not enter in on the same foundation. That Christianity, in some sense, was not quite there when it came to the feminine side of the providence, God's providence. So I see that, like Alfred North Whitehead, he had Teilhard de Chardin, and a few others. It seems to me that they were actually offering more of a feminine perspective, especially like with Whitehead's theory, because John Cobb himself, when he developed process theology, he actually said that God is feminine as well as masculine. But there were several things that he brought out which much more emphasized the feminine side. So I think that we have to really take time to look at what particles have to offer, because in process theory, then particles themselves have some creativity. Particles themselves actually make a choice. So the role of God is more to offer the next step in every part of the evolution, but it's still it's still the prerogative of the created beings to choose. And obviously you can't have particles sort of rebelling and going off on their own and doing something totally crazy. That's not what anybody thinks. But still, how they harmonize things, how they created atoms, particles, and so on. All of that, there were decisions made. So to me, that's another part of the evolution that we have not really understood, or that we haven't really looked at, So I guess to some degree, I think that evolutionary panentheism would be a very good sort of partner to what you suggested. I wouldn't say one or the other. I don't think evolutionary panentheism is everything, but I think it's a really good idea if we actually look at what evolutionary panentheism says. So panentheism is the idea that God is both transcendent and immanent. So God is both up there on a cloud giving the laws, but God is also down here within every single particle, every single being. And there's no such thing as a totally inert particle or a totally inert organism. So we have a theory of the organism. So anyway, that's just my suggestion. I think your presentation is wonderful. I have nothing to criticize. Just I would offer to widen it a little bit. Thank you.
So, Alison, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've raised lots of new areas of complexity.
Sorry.
I just want to understand one point you made, and I wonder if Dr. Wilson, before we have our discussion, might want to just make a few comments in response. But are you saying that you put a lot of emphasis on consciousness, and I think you're differentiating consciousness from law? Is that right?
Consciousness is wider than law.
And you're saying that consciousness has an impact on the growth process as well as law.
Actually, I'm saying the growth process takes place within consciousness. I didn't say that, but that's what I'm saying now. Yeah.
Could you explain that? Elaborate that just a little bit?
I think that, mind is prior to matter. So I think that the whole of creation exists within the mind of God. So the mind of God is what we call consciousness. And this is actually where many people are going for a new paradigm of physics towards the idea that the universe exists within original consciousness. And if you like, I can talk about it on May 21st.
Okay.
Yeah, like that.
And you referred to evolutionary, did you say pantheism? Is that what you said?
No, panentheism. It's a little bit different. Pantheism is the idea that God sort of is the universe. Panentheism has God both transcendent and immanent.
Panentheism.
Yeah, pan-E-N-theism.
Okay, well, I'm afraid you're going to have to explain that when you if you don't mind, would be very, because you're the second person that's mentioned that to me today.
Oh gosh.
Yes, apparently it's being taken. That's well, in a sense, you're saying that's a kind of a midway between the idea that creation, the principle says that the laws of science act autonomously from God, right? That God set everything up and then just stood back. Now, I know Dr. Wilson's gonna say that's not what it says, but I think that, but you're saying that actually God's consciousness is present in
in everything. We exist within consciousness. Yeah.
Panentheism. Okay, Dr. Wilson, before we have our discussion, would you like to make any comments in response to Alison?
I think Alison has given us some remarkable points of departure for developing this further. Even the idea of the anthropic principle, if there's consciousness involved in the evolution of the universe, then this would be another way for the universe to have formed in a manner that is fine-tuned, because the very consciousness of matter would have fine-tuned it. So I mean, I don't think that eliminates the supposition of a transcendent God, but if we combine these two, male and female, together, it provides a way to make it easier, to make life easier for the male God, because the male God doesn't have to set the dial so precisely, 1 part in 10 to the 120th, there can be some kind of give and take between God's purpose and the developing consciousness of matter. So I think this is really a missing point that is really good to bring up. And of course, in living things, we have epigenetics, and epigenetics provides all kinds of room for consciousness. And one of the main types of experiments that is done with epigenetics has to do with stress. And stress is both a mental phenomena and a biological phenomena. So there again, you have the introduction of consciousness into the expression of genes. So the genes becomes like the raw material that consciousness is acting upon. So matter is like the substrate, and the active principle is more and more consciousness. So I think this is the right direction to go on. And I think that this is all great stuff that needs to be worked out, and more thought needs to be given. So thank you, Alison.
Alison, you've got some heavy lifting to do when you give your talk on higher purpose form.
Okay.
Heavy lifting. There's a very serious issues that you've brought into this conversation, and it's great to have a female perspective to create a little synergy, which we really need.
I'd like to put in a plug for Dr. Wilson's course. It was my enrollment management hat, Divine Principle in Depth. I took his course. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I learned a lot. Jim, I didn't mention at the beginning, you also are a student here at HJI. I'm not sure if you've taken his class, but I really recommend it to everyone. And I learned a lot on those four presentations about growth. And it's one area that I think that the principal needs development in. So Dr. Wilson making a great contribution in that way. And you're welcome to apply to HJI and take that class.
I strongly recommend it. Even if you just take one course and don't join a degree program. There's so much going on at HJI. Well, we've come to the end of the road, and David Burton didn't raise his hand. I don't know why. Because David's a real scientist, and he's got a lot to share with us here. Thank you, everyone, very much. Before we sign off, let's give a big round of applause to Alison and Alison Wakelin and Dr. Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison.
Thanks.
Make sure you come back when it's Alison's turn. She's coming up soon.
I think the two of us, you and I, Alison, we should have like a roundtable discussion.
Yeah, we need one.
That would be very interesting.
Yeah.
Idea. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Dean Boyd.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.